As I mentioned in my introduction, I'm into environmental performance metrics based on life cycle assessment, and I can explain how we've used them through our work over about 10 years with the sugarcane industry. So just by way of introduction, this is I find this useful to describe the supply chain or the life cycle. In business you might call it the supply chain. In this field we call it the product life cycle, from cradle to grave, so from the extraction of resources from the environment to manufacture inputs, etc., which go into as inputs, say, to agriculture. And then we put lots of fuel in along the way to, grow and harvest and transport, and then we break up the sugar into juice and fibre and produce a range of products which then become things that we consume in the case of sugar, but we also have byproducts, for example. Now, along the way, every single one of these processes interact with the environment. There's environmental exchanges. We extract resources from the environment, and then we emit substances to the environment and rely on the planet to assimilate those. And so along life cycle assessment as an assessment techniques sort of works out what all those exchanges with the environment are and quantifies them. So it's heavily quantitative information, which lends itself nicely to generating environmental performance indicators for products, for example. Now on here, I've just sort of shown some few examples of some of those exchanges. For example, sugarcane growing it's a very big biomass crop, uses quite a lot of nutrients, and a lot of nutrients can be lost to the environment, and the industry is working very hard to minimise that in terms of protecting the Great Barrier Reef in our context. There are also things like the small amount of burning that still takes place, has some particulates and materials that it emits. And of course, in various points where we use fuel, diesel fuel, we have sort of emissions there. All of those sort of contribute to a range of different environmental impacts. Of course, the one that we've been speaking about a lot is greenhouse gas emissions as a pollutant. And you'd be aware that it's not just carbon. We also have other substances that are probably worse than carbon and highly relevant for agriculture. There are also some carbon that we count and some carbon that we don't. So there are quite established rules and methods for how you count carbon, and lots of methodological choices we need to make consistently. So carbon that goes round and round in the biogenic cycle, because you could call that good carbon. We don't count that. The globe has this natural biogenic carbon cycle. We don't actually count those. We're actually interested in the carbon that is drawn up from underneath the earth as fossil carbon, and we add it to the atmosphere, so that they're the black ones. So this gives a sense that we, add up all those substances across the life cycle, aggregate them, and then we end up with a carbon footprint in this case. So this is just another way of describing that for a production process where you're starting with extraction through to assembly, and then of course use phases and disposal. We've got resource use, and then we emit stuff to the atmosphere. We emit stuff to the environment, and we've got this fairly wide range of all sorts of environmental impacts that occur. I won't go into too much of the detail. These are just the range of environmental aspects that we would like to consider. It is more common, though, that when you're looking at a particular product or a service, you might work out which ones are the most significant, and you might focus on a few. For agriculture, we focus on climate change. We focus on eutrophication, toxicity in terms of herbicide, pesticide use, land stress, water stress. Minerals depletion is becoming quite important. We're not going to have much phosphorus fairly soon. And of course, the fossil fuel resource depletion has been around since the 70s as a concern. So this was what I was talking about, being holistic. And I'll show you some. So there's some of these applications of how we've been using it. Will sort of give you more of a tangible idea of how we can use this. So this is work that started after my PhD, which I started around about the time when environmental life cycle assessment tools with life cycle assessment method was just starting to evolve and be applied to agriculture. And then the Sugar Research and Development Corporation at the time funded me to convert the assessment, the very detailed assessment I did into a tool that could be used by industry so that technique could be more accessible. And this is a tool called the Cane LCA tool, which I've been fortunate to be able to continue using with the industry to inform some of the sort of decisions that they make. So the aim is to sort of streamline and make more accessible the methods for calculating some of these indicators we just looked at there, carbon footprint. Water use is also quite important. But interesting enough, these are the two that have been driving environmental impact improvements in the sugar industry, because they've got this important stewardship role in terms of protecting the Great Barrier Reef. So managing nutrients and managing pesticides are very important, and we reflect those potential impacts in a couple of indicators. Along the way, as you improve things, along the way, you can also influence your carbon footprint, your fossil fuels, and increasingly they're getting a bit more interested in that. So it allows us to gather data from a farming system and turn that into quantitative environmental performance. And in this example, we've scaled it so we can generate absolute values, which are often not very meaningful to people. So we found it might be useful to represent them as relative performance values. So this scale of 0 to 100 represents the scale of expected environmental performance for the industry. So, very high impact systems and very sort of low impact systems. So this is sort of how, like, if you're 40% score for water quality, it means that you're in the lower half, you're in the better half of the performers. You only got 40% of the worst impact. So we've sort of been playing around with star ratings for growers, etc. So that really speeds up the process. How we've been using it for about 7 years now with the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, with the agricultural economists, is some innovative cane farmers have made concerted changes to their practices, often, and many of it's driven by the industry's Smart Cane Best Management Practice program, and they've been very interested to validate whether or not the changes that they've made are resulting in improved environmental performance. So we've gone through about sort of 12 different cane farmers who have made changes, and luckily I'm very impressed at how much farmers can retain a knowledge of how they used to grow things even 10, 20 years ago and how they grow things now. So we've been fortunate to be able to get lots of data about before and after, and we model how much that has influenced environmental performance. But interesting, particularly for some of the interest in the room, is also economic performance. So we've done this work parallel with agricultural economists who've got their own tools for calculating farm profitability, for instance. And for a similar reason, they want to be able to convince the farmers that these new practices are good for business as well, so they're more profitable. And that information is more meaningful and more motivating. And so they go in with the farmers in terms of farm profitability, and we, sort of the environment tags along, and we say, oh, by the way, we'll also do an assessment of your environmental performance. And so the environment goes along for the ride with the profitability story. But increasingly over those 7 years or so, we've sort of shifted from growers really mostly interested in how changed farming practices influence their operating costs, and oh yeah, that's nice, but I have no idea what you're talking about, to now farmers actually wanting to go through this process because of this just as much as the economics. So it's been interesting to see that shift. So we've presented here how farm operating costs have either decreased or increased, and the trade-offs across those, and then for each of these environmental indicators, how much generally we're seeing reductions in impacts across the board. So generally we're seeing quite substantial improvements in environmental performance. So it's been a good news win-win sort of story, which the department have found very useful engaging with farmers. So we compiled our findings across that sort of sample of farmers to give a sense of generally what sort of scale of improvements are we seeing from best management practice improvements. So across these different indicators, these ones here are the figures of as a sort of a production weighted averaged improvements between 10 and 20%. reduction in environmental impacts, which is pretty good actually. We're seeing in some of the more recent case studies that we're looking at where farmers are being more innovative and really moving into quite innovative practices. We're actually seeing sort of 30-40% improvements, which is sort of really quite encouraging. And so the next application for this is, so of course they started with an interest in how can we quantify and verify how our practices have helped protect the reef. Noticing that reduced greenhouse gas emissions is sort of comes along as a byproduct. And now, of course, everyone's interested in the carbon story and everyone wants to have a pathway to net zero. And the cane industry is starting to think that way. So this was a paper I gave at the Sugar Industry Conference a couple of years ago where we had enough information to be able to suggest what their pathway to net zero could be. And this is like what their baseline is. So back in 2002, for growing and milling sugarcane, you'd be looking at about 5.5 tonnes of CO2 equivalent for every 100 tonne of cane processed. So that's your sort of starting point. And then the work that we've done on best management practices, so mitigation of cane growing emissions, all that stuff I just talked about, bringing about those sort of 10 to 20%. Takes you down a little bit. There are other things we know you can do, efficient irrigation, energy efficiency in irrigation, renewable energy in irrigation. There's interesting shift towards use of solar on farm for pumping water, gets you a little bit more. Stopping burning of cane in the Burdekin gives you just a smidgen more, not really a big ticket item. So this is really classic story that we see across so much agriculture, innovation towards sustainability. There's got to be a combination of lots and lots of little things, lots and lots of efficiencies across many things. There's never going to be a silver bullet. However, in this case, there is potentially a bit of a silver bullet if you really want to get down to net zero. That's when the miller's role kicks in, and that's where you start to have what we call displacement abatement. So you're not directly reducing emissions yourself, you're not reducing the emissions you produce, but your products can go on to be turned into other products which displace high emissions intensive things like biofuels. So making ethanol that we see in the Bowsers means that they're producing less petroleum in theory. So there's that displacement of a very high emissions intensive. So there's this displacement abatement. So the sugar industry are not necessarily doing it themselves, but if they diversified into bioproducts, having those products on the market influences an abatement. And that if the industry were able to claim those, and we're not sure yet whether you can do that because the methods are still evolving, then that's where the real that industry can have influence. So just by the side, so this idea of having a baseline, I mean, all the agricultural sectors across Australia are wanting to do something similar. Have already got perhaps their own assessments, but we're finding across all the sectors, everyone's doing it slightly differently. There's enough choice in methods that people make certain choices that it's hard to compare, the footprints of grains with sugar, with sort of dairy or whatever. So there's a desperate need to give that sort of consistent face of Australian agriculture to the world markets, so that we're not fighting amongst ourselves, that we've got this consistent face. This is a project that I've been working with CSIRO on, a common approach to basically generating these baseline greenhouse gas accounts so that we can be confident that agriculture is counting carbon in the same sort of way and then consistently reporting emission reductions. And that's, if you're interested, that's sort of in consultation phase now. So, of course, we've heard already some great introductions in relation to the carbon markets and things. And so these are the techniques where you would actually quantify what your carbon dioxide reduction, what your greenhouse gas reductions are, leading to this. And again, there's a whole lot of set of rules, etc. I guess this is a good example of that point I made before about we've also got to be careful not to always just focus on the carbon story. And I'm really pleased to see that many of these mechanisms are also considering co-benefits. You might have heard that terminology. Yes, we want greenhouse gas reduction, but we actually would like to see those that also bring co-benefits. And one thing that we've been doing some work with the federal government agency that that administers the emission reduction fund and that decides what new methods there should be. And we've been looking with them at testing whether there's potential for leakage from the use of agricultural residues for bioproduction. So biochar or bioethanol or biomethane that goes into the pipeline. If we harness those things we often refer to as wastes, and turn them into something useful, is that going to get us a net greenhouse gas outcome? And some of the things we're finding, and this has been importantly influenced by Peter Grace and David Rowling's contribution to this project in modelling what happens in an agricultural system when you start to remove those agricultural residues. And we weren't too surprised when we found that actually takes you backwards from a carbon point of view. But the trick is that it's very regionally specific. So in some areas, you can have some benefits by taking the trash away because of climate or soil conditions. In other areas, it's very problematic if you take trash away. And, North Queensland catchments that flow into the Great Barrier Reef is a very good example. So Department of Environment and Science have been working with those industries for a very long time now to encourage people to protect soils by keeping the trash there so they don't lose sediment, nitrogen, phosphorus, etc. So and we were able to determine that because we also evaluated the water quality implications of doing that. And you could see this very classic trade-off situation that we often have when we're making innovation for sustainability, is if we got too carried away and took agricultural residues from Queensland and turned them into, say, biomethane or whatever, we risk losing the reef. So it's a trade-off between, do we want to protect the reef or do we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? So that's quite an extreme trade-off, but there's myriads of all sorts of other. So that was my sort of cautionary tale, and that's why we need to be considering greenhouse gas mitigation in the context of other emissions as well. And of course, increasingly, and this has been floating around for quite a while, but we'll probably see more of it, is certification schemes that allow companies to sort of verify that they're doing the right thing, and they've been evolving in the background over time. For sugarcane, there's the Bon Sucro scheme. This is the Roundtable for Sustainable Biofuels, for instance. This is an emerging out of Europe as a very powerful mechanism, environmental product declaration system, heavily based on LCA, where you have to present data across a wide range of metrics. And that's the sort of, if you want to sell stuff into Europe and you need to provide some sort of verification, you have to do it via an EPD. So there's lots of consultants setting themselves up now to do them in Australia. And this is a professional association that I'm part of, the Australian Lifecycle Assessment Society, and one of our roles is a collective is to develop best practice guides for doing LCA in Australia, so that you can be sure that you'll be doing them in compliance with schemes such as this. So that's all been happening in a voluntary capacity up until recently. So I guess that gives you a sort of a flavour of how LCA builds the quantitative foundation for a lot of this stuff. And, it's been so pleasing to see people wanting to move into good policy, for particularly agriculture sectors, and starting to work with, so for example, starting a project with cane growers where they really want to be able to know what they can guide their farmers in, what should farmers be doing to respond to this appropriately. If we made practice changes, what's the best practice? What's the top 10 practice changes that you can make? And I think there's the reason I was really interested in coming to this session is because it's one thing to have numbers and evidence, but there's so much else that gets taken into consideration when sectors want to make decisions and influence change. And so that's a question I have, and I'm hoping discussions with your group might sort of help answer that, so that we can start to present LCA-based information in a way that's digestible, matches what their needs are. So that was very fast. Sorry.